So this halacha of learning Hilchas Pesach 30 days before, and it's this discussion if it's limited to Pesach because there's so many halachas, kashering, and all the different laws of Pesach. Does it also apply to Shulas and other Yom Tovim? We don't have to worry about that now, since we're talking Pesach, so it clearly applies 30 days before. Interesting, on the day of Purim is when you start learning about Hilchas Pesach. That's the 30-day period. So the prohibition by Chametz is unique compared to the other Isurim, other prohibitions. Normally, we know there's an Isur to eat non-kosher, treif, and there's an Isur to eat Chametz. But in addition to the prohibition of eating Chametz, there's a prohibition of owning Chametz, Bal Yira, Bal Yimatzah. There's no prohibition of owning non-kosher. There's a prohibition of getting benefit from milk and meat, and perhaps being in the business of basar, v'chalav, and treifus, etc. But there's no prohibition of owning it. Why over here by Chametz do we find there's a prohibition of owning Chametz, yet we don't find it by non-kosher? So there's a famous Tosas at the beginning of Psachim that, because that's something we used to all year round. In other words, the assumption is non-kosher food you don't eat all year round, so therefore we're not worried. So therefore there's no special prohibition. But Chametz, we're used to eating melt away all year round. We're used to eating a nice pastrami sandwich. Pastrami you probably could still have, but the sandwich part you can't have. So it's something if you see, because the concern is you'll forget it's Pesach if it's sitting on the table or around. So therefore we were more concerned by Chametz. It's something that it's normally we're used to eating, and therefore we made as well an extra thing of not owning it, but also that's why we do the bedika and the bitto, etc. We do many other things. As we'll see, we'll get into it. The Ran raises an interesting point. The Ran says that normally we know we're familiar with Gzeiras D'Rabbanan. We're familiar with rabbinic decrees, like the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. I say, put a siyag, you put a fence around something. Usually it's a biblical law, and the rabbis put a fence around it to protect it. The Ran says, a big chiddush, you know what the Ran says? Really, you know why you can't own Chametz? It's a preventive measure not to eat Chametz. But it's not just the rabbis making this decree, it's the Torah. It's a case where you have a Torah is putting a fence around it. So normally it's a rabbinic decree, here it's a Torah decree. And min Torah you can't own Chametz because you might come to eat it. So Rav Yosef Engel points out in the Sefer Lechach Tov that this really isn't the only case, but there's some other cases as well where we find biblical fences. Like for instance, so he gives a couple examples. Speaking about basar v'chalav, speaking about milk and meat. So the Torah writes, V'osavasho gedi b'chalavimo, writes 3 times in the Torah, not to cook milk and meat together. So why do we need 3 times? So the Gemara tells us once, there's an Isser Achila, there's an Isser to eat, there's an Isser Hana, etc. And there's an Isser of Bishul. So you need 3 psukim. So we see that when the Torah writes it the same way. It focuses on V'osavasho, not to cook. So the question is, why are we concerned? What's the problem with cooking? So again, so Rav Yosef Engel quotes some opinions that say, really, we don't really care about cooking. We care about eating. We don't want you eating basar v'chalav. We don't want you having milk and meat together. However, to make as another example where they made a biblical, not the rabbis, the Torah said, you know what? And you can't cook basar v'chalav as a preventive measure, another step away from eating it. And the main focus is the eating, even though for the Torah itself the focus seems to be on the bishul, but these Rishonim say no, the main part we're concerned about is the eating, and the bishul is like a biblical preventive decree. kind of like Rav Soloveitchik, I think they said over at his name, I think that they were discussing the question in a science lab. Obviously, it wasn't food they were going to be eating. Probably wasn't edible, maybe even dangerous to eat. And the question was, in part of the experiment, they had to mix milk and meat. So part of the whole discussion on whether it was okay or not, so they touch on this nakuda. If you assume the main reason for the bishul is only because of eating and it's something you can't eat, so perhaps we could discuss maybe that'd be okay. It gets into darshinan time at the kra, taking the reason and limiting the scope, but that's just on the side. That's what Rav Soloveitchik and other posts can discuss that question. But so that's one example. So we have the Ran writes by Pesach, the Isser of owning chametz is a biblical prohibition not to come to eat it, and Rav Yosef Engel quotes opinions that say the same thing by you can't cook milk and meat, but the concern is to not eat milk and meat. Another example Rav Yosef Engel gives is, we know we have a biblical mitzvah, it's a discussion among the Rishonim, and the Gemara actually talks about Tosefes Yom HaKippurim. Well, halacha l'maisa, that's the only clear-cut day where there's a mitzvah of Tosefes. That everyone agrees that adding on to Yom Kippur is a mitzvah min HaTorah, because that's the Gemara. So it's a discussion among the Rishonim. What about Tosefes Shabbos, Tosefes Yontiv? We add to Shabbos and Yontiv all the time. Is that a biblical mitzvah or rabbinical? So it's a machlokas. We assume it's biblical. So we assume even Tosefes Shabbos is a biblical mitzvah. So what's the reason behind the mitzvah of adding to Shabbos? So again, so we quote some opinions that say the reason for adding to Shabbos is the concern is that God knows exactly when Shabbos begins, and therefore He could stop the moment before. But humans don't know exactly, so if you wait to the last minute, we know what happens after the 18, we're always running late. But if you wait to the last minute, ultimately you'll end up being Machal Shabbos. But whether it's 18 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever the minute is, you bring in Shabbos early, it's a biblical decree that you shouldn't come to Machal Shabbos. So similar, another example where the Torah itself makes a decree over, as opposed to the rabbis, it's the Torah. Another example he gives is Chatzi Shir. There's a prohibition in the Torah. There's a prohibition in the Torah that you can't eat treif, non-kosher. So, and the halach is the normal shir is a kazayas. You can't eat a kazayas. If you eat a kazayas of non-kosher, you get a good old-fashioned whooping. You get makas. What happens? The Gemara raises in Yuma and other places. What happens if you only have a bite of the Big Mac, a bite of the hamburger? So again, for our purposes, anything less than a kazayas is considered chatzi shir. It's not a matter of half the amount. It means anything under a kazayas is considered chatzi shir. Like similarly, like we call it chatzi halal. But as like people like saying, it's not really chatzi halal. It's really 75% of halal. But chatzi halal just means not the full halal. It's not as chatzi in the word. It's not the focus is on the half point. The point is less than the prescribed amount. So what happens if I eat less than I take just a bite of a Big Mac? I don't have a whole kazayas. So that's a machlokas in the Gemara between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says it's asur min Torah, even to have a chatzi zayis, and Rish Lakish says it's asur d'Rabbanan. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says they're both asur min Torah, so what's the difference if I eat a kazayas or less? The difference is a punishment. If you eat a kazayas, you get makas. If you eat less than a kazayas, and you still violate a biblical prohibition, you just don't get it. It's not associated with a punishment. So Rabbi Yosef Engel brings down some opinions that say, what's the reason behind the biblical prohibition, according to Rabbi Yochanan, of chatzi shir? Again, it's a preventive measure. We don't want you eating kazayas of treif. The Torah says you can't eat a chatzi zayis because the concern is that you'll end up eating kazayas, therefore they make a preventive measure by chatzi shir. And in fact, that's what he points out by grapes as well. We know Nazir is also to have wine. So some bring down, that also the issue of grapes is like a gzeira, that you can't have grapes because we want you to stay away from wine. So that's a gzeira min Torah. So they discuss, what about if you have a chatzi shir of grapes? So on one hand, we normally have a principle, you don't make a gzeira on a gzeira, assuming that both the gzeira, chatzi shir up to full shir, or grapes up to wine. So normally we say ein goes gzeira, but perhaps that's only when we're dealing with the drabanan. But perhaps by biblically speaking, you are, so that's a discussion. So either way, that the Rana is a big chiddush, that Bal Yiraya is a biblical, well, that's not the chiddush. Everyone agrees only chametz on Pesach is biblical. That's the pasuk. The chiddush of the Rana is that it's a biblical fence around the Torah. That normally the rabbis make a rabbinical fence around to protect the Torah, but we see that certain times the Torah itself, and since chametz, since it's so severe, because eating chametz is kares and all the things associated with Pesach, so therefore, according to the Ran, the Torah made a biblical decree to prevent us from eating. So that's the sheet of the Ran, and Rabbi Yosef Egel just points out that it's not limited to that case, but it's just one of them. So that's the halacha of Bal Yira Bal Yimat. So we know what we do on Pesach is we do the Leil Yudala the night before Pesach. We do it as a mitzvah of bedikas chametz. There's a mitzvah of checking the chametz. And the Gemara tells us in Psachim bittul bi'al masagi, that there's also a mitzvah of nullifying the chametz. And the Gemara says nullifying the chametz min Torah works. In other words, the Gemara says if you nullify the chametz, why are you nullifying the chametz? Because if I nullify the chametz, we'll get into it about what it means, the Rashi and Tosas, but simply it means that you nullify the chametz, you no longer own it. If you no longer own it, you don't violate Bal Yira or Bal Yimatzeh. So they point out we know there's a mitzvah, we do bedika on the night of Yudalid, and then at the end we do Kol Chamira, we do it both at night and in the morning to cover all the opinions. So the Gemara in Psachim says something that the Gemara is making it sound like it's a big chiddush, but the question is why. The Gemara talks about if you do bedika, habodek sarach levarach. The Gemara says one who does bedikas chametz has to make a bracha. The question is, well, he discovered America. Okay, so last I checked, we know the general rule in the Gemara that we know that the general clause before you do any mitzvah, usually over lasiyason, you make the bracha first and you do the mitzvah. So what is the Gemara telling me? You know what? I have something to tell you, that when you're doing bedika, you have to make a... Why would I think that you would make a bracha on bedika? In other words, what's the chiddush of the Gemara that habodek sarach levar? In other words, there seems to be a reason to think why I wouldn't. Comes the Gemara and tells me why. So based on the Rush and other Rishonim, they point out as a general principle, you only make a bracha when you're doing a mitzvah. In general, Chazal only to do the bracha when you're doing a performance in a mitzvah. Merely to avoid a prohibition, a rabbi's never instituted a bracha. Like for instance, there's the status of an onain. An onain is someone after the death, before the burial. Of course, not the one who died, because meisim chafshi min mitzvahs. Once you're dead, you're exempt from mitzvahs. But the kruvim, the people who are obligated in the burial, so the halacha is they're obligated in the burial, and therefore they have to be osek b'kfura, and therefore they're patur min mitzvahs. So there's a machlokas, Rashi and Tosfos in the beginning of brachas in the third parak. They're exempt, but are they allowed to do mitzvahs? So from Rashi it's mashma, yeah. You're not obligated, if you could rise above the situation and transcend it, and you can have kavanah and go ahead and make a bracha. There's no obligation, but harishus biyado. And Tosfos close to the Yerushalmi, no. It's usher. You're prohibited to make a bracha. Al kavod hameis, because there's a concept of lo egel rush. We don't walk into a cemetery with our sisters hanging out, or learning, so to speak, we're mocking the dead. Ha ha, I can learn, you can, I can do mitzvahs. So therefore, Tosfos says it's usher to make a bracha, al kavod hameis. So the question is, and we paskin like Tosfos. We paskin like Tosfos, and it's usher for an onin to do mitzvahs. So the Piskei Tshuva raises the question: what about an onin who wants to eat bread? So what's the issue of eating bread? Because we know in order to eat bread, one has to wash the tila shadayim. So, but there's a problem. On one hand, there's two different dinim d'Rabbanan here. There's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan that you have to wash your hands before eating bread. And there's a issa d'Rabbanan, you can't eat bread unless you wash your hands. So he says an onin is patim and a mitzvah, so what does he do? So the Piskei Tshuva writes, he eats bread, he washes his hands without a bracha. Why, is that some type of compromise din? Why do you wash your hands without a bracha? So he explains this principle because we said the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of washing your hands before you eat bread, that he's exempt from. In fact, it's us of him to do. So the only reason he's washing his hands is because of the Issa d'Rabbanan to eat bread without washing your hands. So the only reason an onin is doing this washing is to stay away from doing an aveira. He wants to stay away from the aveira of eating bread without washing his hands. So we say the principle is, anytime you doing something to avoid a prohibition, there is no bracha. And similarly, the Minchas Chinuch writes by an onin on Sukkos. What is an onin? If someone dies cholamayid and before the burial, you're an onin. So what do? Do you have to eat in the sukkah on Sukkos? So the Minchas Chinuch discusses the issue, machlokes, the discussion, the Gemara, the Rishonim, is there an isser to eat chutz sukkah? Is there a prohibition? We know you have to eat in the sukkah, but what's pshat? Is it that if you don't eat in the sukkah, you violate an isser, a prohibition, or no? There's an asay to eat in the sukkah, but there's no aveira to eat chutz sukkah. So what's the difference? If I say there's an isser to eat outside the sukkah, or no, just a mitzvah.
Then you say that the...
Yeah, so the Minchas Chinuch point out, would an onin be chayav to eat in the sukkah while he's an onin? If you assume there's an isser to eat chutz sukkah, so he'll eat in the sukkah without a bracha. Because the only reason, from the mitzvahs I say he's exempt from. But if there's an isser to eat in the sukkah, if there's an isser to eat outside the sukkah, so then he'd be eating in the sukkah without a bracha again, because you don't make a bracha on something which you could prevent. It's only doing to prevent violating an isser. In fact, that's what I think they point out. We know when we wash our hands before bread, mayim rishonim, we make a bracha. But mayim achronim, we don't make a bracha. And mayim achronim, and some say because it's also, according to some of it, the sakana of the salt, melech sedomis, and you touch it, you're going to go blind. So you don't make the bracha on mayim achronim, but there's a discussion. But what about this Mayim Emsoim, the middle waters? So what's the middle waters? So that's only if let's say you're in the same meal, you're going from milk to meat. Let's say on Shavuos. So the halacha is, before you go from milk to meat, besides maybe doing other things, washing your mouth, eating a cracker, you have to wash your hands. So everyone agrees there's no bracha on mayim, there's no bracha on the middle waters. Why? Because the whole reason for the takana was to prevent you from eating basar v'cholav. So based on this yisod, that's what I want to explain the Gemara's Havamina. The Gemara says, you know what? Habodek sarach levarach. One who does bedikas chametz has to make a bracha. The question is, well, of course, bedikas chametz is a mitzvah.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't? So the answer is because perhaps the only reason we're doing bedika is the main function is to avoid the violation of bayira, bayimatzah. Some say that bedika, you shouldn't come to eat it. But some say the reason is, you shouldn't come to whatever the different Rishonim, what issue we're trying to prevent. But some Rishonim bring down, part of it is that we're considering the bedika to make sure you don't have chametz sitting on your table, you come to eat it. So if that's the reason, so we understand. So you might think that the main purpose or only purpose of bedika is to avoid the isser of bayira or achilas chametz. Kamash Bala, no. It is true, it helps you prevent an isser, but Chazal is an independent mitzvah. There's a mitzvah independently besides the isser, and the raya is the bracha, because we only make brachas on things that are advar mitzvah, things to do to prevent an isser. Chazal never instituted a bracha. So let's summarize. So we discussed the unique prohibition of the isser of chametz, that unique in the sense that normally is only a prohibition to eat chametz, but by Pesach we have a prohibition to own it. And we said either, and the Ran we said at a big chiddush, that the reason why the Torah said not to own chametz is because since it's an isser kares, eating chametz on Pesach is a very severe prohibition. Therefore, the Torah itself made a biblical decree around it, in contrast to a gzeira draban. And we gave different examples. Rabbi Yosef Engel brought down. We gave the example of basar v'chalav, that perhaps the main concern is eating, but they said not to cook it, a preventive measure. We said Tosefes Shabbos. The concern is not to eat the Chilul Shabbos, so therefore you start Shabbos early. Or we said Chatzi Shir according to Rabbi Yochanan. The reason is to avoid it. The reason is we don't want you to eat Chatzi Shir, you might come to eat a full share. Then we discussed the issue with grapes for another as wine, and perhaps a Chatzi share of grapes that gets into whether your ain goes in Zera or Gzera. And then we pointed out, we know there's a mitzvah bedikas chametz bittul, and we'll get into that more next time. And midaraisa bittul b'yam masagi. So the Gemara seems to make a big deal about bodek sarach levarach. So we explain of course, bodek sarach levarach. I put on tefillin, I have to make a bracha. I make a bracha. That's why they institute birkas mitzvah. So therefore, that's what based on the Rishonim that we have the yisod that you only make a bracha when you're doing it to perform a mitzvah. But if you're doing something to avoid a prohibition, then you don't make a bracha. But that's why we gave different examples of an onaim. During his regular time, he washes without making a bracha because he only washes to avoid the isser. Onaim and sukkahs as well. And then the issue in general, some say there's no bracha on building a fence around your pool, a makkah, or on your roof, is because it's to prevent someone from getting hurt. So that's so the Havamina of the Gemara was that the main purpose of bedikas chametz is this merely coming to avoid the isser of achilas chametz or bayura bayimatzeh. Kamash malan, the chiddush is to know that bedikas chametz is an independent mitzvah and hence Chazal instituted a bracha on the bedika.